In the late 1800s, long before computers, prefabrication, or fast-track construction, American engineers built bridges with a single expectation. They should last longer than the people who built them. Cities were expanding, railroads were conquering the continent, and river crossings were becoming the backbone of national commerce. Yet the builders of the era approached each new span not as a temporary structure, but as a generational investment, something their grandchildren would cross without fear. These early bridges fall into three main categories: stone arches, heavy riveted steel trusses, and massive industrial railway spans. What they shared was a philosophy of permanence. Stone arches were laid block by block, using principles dating back to Roman engineering. Steel truss bridges were assembled from thick plates, gussets, and angles that were bolted and riveted into multi-layered joints. Railroad bridges, designed for locomotives far heavier than any vehicle on modern highways, were built with safety factors that would be considered extreme by today's standards. To the engineers of the time, weight wasn't a liability. It was security. A steel member might be 3 times thicker than technically necessary. A joint might have dozens of rivets where calculations required only a handful. These choices were not wasteful. They were intentional. Overbuilding reduced stress, slowed fatigue, and gave the structure a resilience that modern bridges rarely match. Craftsmanship also played a defining role. Riveting crews operated like precision machines, heating, hammering, and closing each rivet in seconds. Stonemasons shaped individual blocks by hand, ensuring perfect fit without relying on adhesives or flexible fillers. Every component reflected careful labor rather than cost-driven shortcuts. Even at the time, these bridges were recognized as extraordinary. But no one predicted just how long they would endure. Many of the stone arches built in the 1880s still carry traffic today with no significant structural distress. Early steel trusses have survived floods, earthquakes, and millions of load cycles without showing the cracking common in many welded modern bridges. This era of overbuilt, labor-intensive bridge construction created infrastructure so durable that it continues working more than 100 years later, a legacy modern engineers often struggle to replicate. And the reasons why begin with the mindset of the people who built them. When American bridge engineers of the late 19th and early 20th centuries designed a structure, they rarely thought in terms of minimum requirements. Instead, they thought in terms of failure and how to prevent it at all costs. Their engineering decisions reflected a worldview shaped by harsh realities: extreme weather, rapidly growing railroads, unpredictable floods, and the simple fact that a single bridge collapse could isolate an entire region for months. The first principle was mass and redundancy. Early engineers routinely multiplied their safety factors, sometimes doubling or even tripling the amount of steel or stone required. Railroad trusses in particular were famous for their oversized members: 3/4-inch or 1-inch steel plate webs, deep gusset connections, and heavy angle cords that resisted bending far beyond the theoretical limits. If a single component weakened, there was always another layer of material ready to carry the load. Another core principle was joint reliability. Before welding became standard, engineers relied on riveted connections. Riveting wasn't just a construction method, it was a safety feature. Each rivet, once heated and hammered tight, shrank as it cooled, clamping steel plates together with enormous force. Multiple layers of overlapping plates distributed stress across large areas, preventing the sharp stress concentrations that plague modern welded joints. If one rivet failed, dozens more continued to hold the structure securely. Engineers also prioritized material longevity over cost. Early steel production was slower, more controlled, and focused heavily on purity. Mills tested every batch, rejected faulty pieces, and maintained strict quality standards. The result was steel with consistent carbon content, low impurities, and stable grain structure, properties that contributed to century-long resilience. Environmental challenges also shaped design. Engineers understood that freeze-thaw cycles, river ice, and seasonal flooding could destroy bridges not built for worst-case scenarios. So foundations were dug deep into bedrock, piers were massively overbuilt, and abutments were designed to resist decades of hydraulic pressure. These decisions were not made because early engineers lacked efficiency. They were made because they respected the consequences of failure. Their bridges had to survive storms, locomotives, and time itself. And their insistence on redundancy, mass, and robustness laid the foundation for structures that would endure long after their creators were gone. To understand why America's old bridges lasted more than a century, you have to look at how they were built. The construction techniques used between the 1880s and the 1930s were slow, manual, and intensely physical. But they produced structures with extraordinary durability. Each method, whether stonemasonry or riveted steelwork, relied on principles that modern fast-paced construction rarely matches. Stone arch bridges were the oldest and most time-tested. Builders shaped each block individually, adjusting angles and surfaces by hand until the stones locked together without relying on mortar for structural strength. The arch transferred weight directly into the ground, creating a system that grew stronger as more load was applied. As long as the stones remained in place, the bridge remained stable, which is why many 19th century stone bridges still carry traffic today with virtually no maintenance. Steel bridges, however, defined America's industrial era, and their most important feature was the riveted connection. When a red-hot rivet was inserted through steel plates and hammered tight, it shrank as it cooled, clamping the plates together with enormous compressive force. Unlike welded joints, which create a single fused seam, riveted joints spread stress across a wide area. If one rivet loosened or failed, dozens around it continued carrying the load. This gave early steel bridges natural redundancy and resilience. The steel itself also mattered. Early mills produced thick plates and angles that were often heavier than strictly necessary. But this thickness resisted corrosion and fatigue. A modern welded girder might have a quarter-inch web in some areas. A 1905 plate girder bridge might use steel 3 times thicker. That difference alone can add decades of life to a structure. Construction crews worked with precision born from repetition. Riveting gangs operated in synchronized rhythm. A heater, a catcher, a bucker, and a riveter, each performing his part within seconds. Their work produced joints that remained tight for generations. Meanwhile, stonemasons and ironworkers shaped and fitted components with an attention to detail rarely seen in high-speed modern construction. Together, these techniques created bridges that were not merely assembled, but crafted. They were built slowly, intentionally, and with durability as the guiding principle, a sharp contrast to the production-driven methods that dominate modern infrastructure. Once America's early bridges entered service, they immediately faced conditions that tested the limits of their design. Heavy locomotives hammered steel trusses day and night. Midwestern rivers froze, expanded, and slammed ice against stone piers. Coastal bridges endured salt spray, humidity, and storms. And yet these structures not only survived, many seemed almost indifferent to the punishment. Their performance revealed just how effective the overbuilt, slow-crafted approach truly was. Stone arch bridges proved nearly immune to environmental stress. Because their strength came from geometry rather than metal, they resisted corrosion, fatigue, and temperature swings with ease. Freeze-thaw cycles that destroy concrete barely affected them. As long as foundations remained stable and water was properly drained, the arch stayed locked in place. This is why dozens of 19th century stone bridges in the Northeast and Midwest continue to function almost exactly as they did when horses and wagons first crossed them. Steel truss bridges demonstrated a different kind of resilience. Their riveted connections acted like shock absorbers, distributing stress across wide surfaces rather than concentrating it at a single weld line. Seasonal temperature changes, which force steel to expand and contract, were absorbed naturally through the small movements allowed by riveted assemblies. Modern welded bridges often crack when their rigid connections can't accommodate those shifts. Riveted joints flexed, breathed, and kept working. Corrosion resistance was another unexpected advantage. Old bridges used thicker steel members, sometimes 2 or 3 times the thickness seen in recent designs. Even when rust formed, it often remained superficial, leaving decades of structural life underneath. Many modern bridges, built with thinner welded plates, cannot tolerate the same surface loss before their structural capacity is compromised. Floods also tested early engineering philosophies. Heavy stone piers and deep foundations anchored bridges firmly into bedrock. When major rivers rose, early bridges held their ground, while lighter modern spans occasionally washed out or suffered scouring damage. Engineers from the 1890s designed for worst-case scenarios, often referencing historical flood records and adding additional margin beyond that. By the mid-20th century, it became clear that America's oldest bridges were outperforming expectations not because of luck, but because they were built with a philosophy centered on endurance. Their real-world performance offered a simple truth. When structures are designed to survive extremes, they often do, for far longer than anyone predicted. One of the most overlooked reasons old American bridges last so long is the fundamental difference between how their connections were made. Early bridges used rivets, thousands of them, hammered tight by crews who worked with precision and consistency. Modern bridges use welding, and while welding is faster, cheaper, and easier to automate, it introduced challenges that older structures were never exposed to. The difference between these two methods helps explain why a century-old truss can remain sturdy, while newer spans often show cracking within decades. A riveted joint behaves like a layered clamp. Steel plates overlap, rivets shrink as they cool, and the entire connection acts as one large, compressed unit. Loads spread naturally across wide surfaces. If one rivet loosens, dozens around it continue to hold the structure together. This creates redundancy, one of the strongest defenses against failure. In engineering terms, riveted joints fail gradually and predictably. They warn you before they fail. Welds, by contrast, are single points of fusion. A welded seam concentrates stress along a narrow line. If the weld is flawed, contaminated, or exposed to extreme temperature cycles, cracks can develop and propagate quickly. Unlike riveted joints, which disperse stress, welds can funnel forces into a single spot. This makes modern bridges vulnerable to fatigue, microscopic cracks that grow over time due to constant vibration from traffic. Another advantage of riveted construction was its ability to flex. Steel expands, contracts, and moves under load. Riveted joints accommodate small shifts, allowing the structure to breathe with environmental changes. Welded joints, being rigid, often resist these movements. Over decades, this rigidity can cause fractures, especially in places with significant temperature swings. Heat treatment also plays a role. Rivets are installed red-hot bonding plates through thermal contraction. Welds introduce intense localized heat, which can alter the surrounding steel's microstructure. This heat-affected zone becomes more brittle and more prone to fatigue cracking than the base metal itself. Finally, riveted bridges use thicker steel, so even minor section loss from corrosion left the structure with significant reserve strength. This combination, flexibility, redundancy, and material thickness, makes riveted connections one of the main reasons America's oldest bridges continue carrying traffic long after many welded structures reach the end of their service life. Across the United States, engineers inspecting aging infrastructure have repeatedly discovered a surprising pattern. Some of the oldest bridges, those built between 1880 and 1930, are not only still standing, but performing better than modern spans built a fraction of the time ago. These examples reveal just how enduring early American engineering really was. One of the most famous cases is the Eads Bridge in St. Louis. Completed in '70, it faced skepticism from engineers who doubted the strength of early steel. Yet today, after 150 years of service, its original steel arches remain structurally sound. Modern inspections show minimal loss of strength, and the bridge still carries rail traffic, a testament to the overbuilt design and durable metallurgy of its era. Stone arch bridges provide even more dramatic longevity. The Zanesville Y Bridge in Ohio, first built in 1814 and reconstructed multiple times using stone and heavy masonry principles, still stands today. Many smaller stone bridges across the Northeast and Midwest have carried continuous traffic for more than a century, with almost no structural intervention. Riveted steel truss bridges also showcase exceptional durability. The Scioto River Bridge in Ohio, built in 1914, continues to function with its original riveted members and gusset plates. Inspectors often find that these bridges retain more than 80 to 90% of their original capacity even after millions of load cycles. In contrast, many welded steel bridges built in the 1970s and 1980s have required major retrofits due to fatigue cracking. Railroad bridges offer some of the most remarkable examples. Heavy rail demands strict performance, yet countless riveted trusses from the early 20th century remain in active service today. Their thick steel members and redundant joints have resisted vibrations, impacts, and weather conditions that would have severely damaged lighter modern designs. Meanwhile, modern bridges, even those built with advanced computers and sophisticated welding techniques, have suffered highly publicized failures. The 2007 I-35W bridge collapse in Minnesota, for example, revealed vulnerabilities in later-generation welded gusset plates and undersized critical members. The contrast is clear. Old bridges built with craftsmanship and heavy materials often continue performing beyond all expectations, while newer bridges sometimes struggle to meet their projected service lives. These real-world examples illustrate a structural truth that modern engineering often overlooks. Durability is not a function of technology alone, but of philosophy. As the 20th century progressed, the philosophy behind bridge building changed dramatically. Where early engineers focused on long-term durability, modern infrastructure increasingly prioritizes speed, cost efficiency, and minimal material usage. These priorities produce bridges that are cheaper and faster to build, but often far less durable than their predecessors. The shift in engineering culture explains why many modern bridges struggle to reach 40 or 50 years, while older ones quietly surpass a century. The most significant change has been the move toward lighter structures. Modern steel members are thinner, optimized for cost rather than redundancy. While this reduces material expenses, it also leaves less margin for corrosion, fatigue, and damage. When a 1905 truss lost a few millimeters of steel to rust, the structure remained secure. When a modern welded girder loses the same amount, it may be dangerously weakened. Another major factor is the widespread use of welded connections. While convenient and efficient, welds create rigid single-point seams that concentrate stress. Over decades, welded joints can develop fatigue cracks that spread quickly, especially under constant truck traffic. Riveted joints, by comparison, allowed micro-movements and distributed load across many points, dramatically slowing fatigue. Modern bridges also rely heavily on pre-stressed concrete, which is cost-effective but prone to long-term deterioration. Moisture intrusion, chloride exposure, and freeze-thaw cycles can corrode internal reinforcement cables. Once corrosion begins, the deterioration tends to accelerate rapidly. Many concrete bridges built in the 1960s and 70s are now reaching the end of their service life, requiring costly repairs or replacement. The materials themselves have changed as well. Today's steel often includes recycled scrap, which introduces trace impurities like copper that increase brittleness and reduce fatigue resistance. Early steelmaking, by contrast, focused on controlled chemistry, pure inputs, and slow cooling, conditions that produced exceptionally stable metal. Finally, modern infrastructure budgets are tighter, and maintenance is often deferred. Early bridges were inspected and maintained regularly, but many of today's structures go years without thorough evaluation. The result is a system designed to meet short-term needs rather than long-term resilience. While modern engineering has achieved extraordinary efficiency, the trade-off has been longevity, a sacrifice early bridge builders would never have accepted. As we look back across more than a century of infrastructure, one truth becomes clear. America's earliest bridge builders created structures meant to outlast the ages. They built slowly, deliberately, and with a belief that public works should serve not just the present generation, but several generations to come. Their bridges remain living artifacts, steel, stone, and iron, reminders of a time when engineering was guided by craftsmanship instead of cost efficiency. The legacy of these early builders is visible in the continued survival of their work. Riveted trusses still stretch across rural rivers, carrying cars and freight trains just as they carried wagons and steam locomotives 100 years ago. Stone arches stand resilient against modern traffic, their geometry as elegant today as when masons shaped each block by hand. Even industrial railway spans built in the age of steam still perform reliably, providing structural lessons for today's engineers. What sets these structures apart is not simply their materials, but the mindset behind them. Early engineers prioritized redundancy, knowing that extra thickness, additional rivets, and deep foundations would pay dividends in durability. They built for worst-case scenarios, floods, temperature extremes, and decades of constant load. This focus on resilience ensured that their bridges would survive far beyond their intended lifespans. Modern infrastructure, on the other hand, reflects a different set of priorities: speed, cost, and efficiency. These goals are not inherently harmful, but when paired with thinner materials, welded joints, and deferred maintenance, they often shorten the lifespan of critical structures. As a result, many modern bridges face premature deterioration that early engineers would have considered unacceptable. Yet the endurance of America's oldest bridges continues to influence contemporary design. Engineers studying long-lived structures have rediscovered the value of thicker steel, redundant connections, protective detailing, and conservative load estimates. Research into century-old riveted bridges even shapes seismic retrofits and fatigue modeling today. Ultimately, the story of America's early bridges is one of engineering humility, an acknowledgement that nature, time, and heavy use will test every structure. The builders of the 19th and early 20th centuries responded to that reality with caution, craftsmanship, and overbuilt strength. Their work still stands because they built not for decades but for centuries, and their legacy endures every time a vehicle crosses a bridge that has already survived more than a lifetime.